we know the 2D image, the x and y, and then the third dimension being the frequency or the velocity. So this is how you can imagine a velocity cube. In such a cube, there are many ways to extract the information. So we can integrate over the entire map, then you get a moment map or an intensity map. You can integrate velocity weighted, so you get a first moment map or a velocity map, because you can recognize the varying motion. Instead of integrating over all the velocities, you can also integrate over spatially over x and y, and then you get an integrated line profile, the spectrum. And instead of integrating, you can also just look at the individual channels. In one channel, we can actually see, if we have high enough resolution, the upper surface and also the lower surface of the disk. Here in the left, you see that. And also within one channel, we can remember that every pixel is actually a spectrum as well. So it's for a light profile as well. So in one cube, in a cube, in one pixel location, you can also extract information individually. And so this is demonstrated then as well. If you take a line profile in different parts of your channel cube, you will essentially see different velocity components here throughout the disk. So a line profile itself has essentially three properties. You have peak intensity, which, as we talked about earlier with chemistry, this is simply related to the gas temperature and the molecular column density. So this is not so much about the kinematics. Then the line center tells you about the velocity structure, so the capillary motion or maybe non-capillary motion on top of that. And then the line width tells you about the dispersion of the velocity, so the number of different velocity components you have at that location. That's a little bit too far up. So this is like a nice graphic overview of the different types of kinematics that you may or may not find in this. So first of all, there's of course the capillary motion. We've already talked about that a lot. But then there's other properties that you may be able to derive as well. So there's turbulence, like turbulent broadening, meridional flows, so essentially material that is falling vertically onto the planet. The planet itself may have a certain planetary disk, which may also be detectable with kinematics. Radial flows through the gap, spiral waves. So if a planet triggers spiral density wave, then there are some creations that also say that you should see that in the kinematics of the CO. And finally, the gap itself can be so there's a lot more than just capillary motion. So if we look at a channel map, remember that we're actually tracing two sides of the disk, and you can really map the disk in three dimensions, so radially, azimuthally, and vertically. So here also you can see that backside of it. And so even if you look at an intensity map, you can essentially trace that intensity as sort of a torus, so not as a flat structure, but something that increases the radius. And there's some tools, I'm going to show that in the end, that can help you to do that if you have the right data. So one of the properties is, of course, not just to say that the disk is flared, but actually constrain the height where the emission is originating. And so again, just looking at one channel, we see that the upper surface layer of the far side and the upper surface of the near side. We see the lower surface of the near side. So you see these different parts of the disk. They're also shown essentially over here, like where does the emission originate? You have the CO layer, the surface layer, but then also the bottom of the CO layer. In between is the CO freeze-out zone. And the whole idea is, of course, that you can, because you're looking kind of through the disk is not face-on but somewhat inclined. If you have high enough sensitivity and resolution, you can really start to see all these different components. And in that way, you can map, like you can trace, that is these green dots here, you can trace what the height is of the peak emission to the brightest point in the channel. And if you do that throughout the disk, you may get something like this. So this is the height of the CO as a function of radius for the 3 different CO isotopologues. And as you can see, the 12 CO is really at the surface, it's most optically thin, while the other CO isotopologues are emitted from further down. And what was found is that this, the emitting scale height for several disks was compared with the scale height from the scattered light images. So you can see that this is the 12 CO, this is the 13 CO, and then in the near-infrared surface is somewhere over here. So it's more, a little bit below the 12 CO, and some above the 13 CO. But it varies a little bit in distance, but it's overall consistent. And then if you have multiple CO isotopologues, so multiple transitions, you remember you can measure the temperature of multiple transitions. And that means that in combination with a vertical height, you can really map the temperature structure radially and vertically using these kind of observations. So this is something that's relatively new. We've only done it for only a handful of papers where they've done this, but it can really help to pin down our temperature structure instead of radiator transfer computing it. We can really test how accurate those estimates are. Okay. Now another example of kinematics is warps. This is actually one of the older examples. It was already clear in several disks that they were not just showing nice butterfly pattern, but there were these weird wiggles in the inner part of the velocity map. So there's several explanations for this. So this is one that we've talked about before, a misalignment between the inner and outer disk, which could be the case for all of them, but it's definitely the case for the ones that have these shadows in the scattered light. But some other alternatives have been proposed as well. For example, if the disk is eccentric, so due to the dynamical perturbations by the star and the companion, you can get an eccentric cavity, and that would also lead to non-Keplerian motion, because essentially you don't have a center of gravity, you have kind of 2 centers of gravity, or like an offset. And finally, you have this idea that maybe if you have material flowing through the gap, because remember the star is still accreting, even if you have a large gap, the material must get there somewhere. So maybe what we're measuring is that inflowing material. That's also called a radial flow. Then there has been quite a bit of talk about sort of kinks in the individual channels. So these are the 2 main observations of that so far. So as you can see, instead of following just a nice curvature, there are in some disks you see that there is a bit of a kink in that curve, and this is reproduced in models of planet-disk interactions. The kinks are actually located at the location of the dust gap. So this has been interpreted as evidence that a planet is creating this sort of spiral density wave, like adjusting the velocity profile through the gap. And that's what we're then seeing here in the observation. So this is considered as evidence for a planet in a gap. Also because this is not like, this is only visible in one location. You don't see it here, you don't see it in the backside. So it's really like a localized planet detection. So that's the idea. Then we have the turbulent broadening. You remember I've shown this picture earlier when we talked specifically about turbulence. So I said, turbulence must be very low because otherwise we would have a different kind of CO line profile. I actually found this plot yesterday, which is demonstrating this point a lot more nicely. So it's a line profile of a disk is typically kind of this is this double peak, with how deep that gap is between the peaks, that depends on the turbulent run. And you can also see it here in the channels, which are all simulations, right? If your turbulent velocity is large, you will get more spread out butterflies. Then when you have a very low turbulence, then you just get something like this. And so also here, based on the data compared with these different turbulent velocities, there's now this general idea that turbulence must be very low in the disks where this has been measured. Okay. Then it is also possible, so when you have the first moment map, you can extract the so-called rotation curve. So measuring the azimuthal velocity as a function of radius. And of course, this azimuthal velocity, you expect it to be Keplerian. But if you extract a profile like this, with d phi as function of radius, you can compare that, with the error bars with a perfect Keplerian profile. And so what was found is that there is actually quite some variations along that profile, which means there is some non-Keplerian motion. And there's this GitHub tool called Eddy that you can use to do this yourself if you're interested in this kind of analysis. So one of the big discoveries using this tool was that you have these variations, these non-Keplerian motion along the radius, and what we concluded there is that you get this non-Keplerian motion because of changes in the pressure, like localized changes in the pressure. And one of the ways to get changes in pressure, changes in gas surface density. So he derived that there had to be drops in the gas surface density based on these changes in the velocity. He actually measured gas gaps without looking at the CO intensity, but by looking at the CO velocity. So that was pretty cool. And another thing that he measured, so kind of now also plotting this velocity variation in as function in the vertical direction. He measured that in the locations of the gaps, so that's the locations of these dashed dotted lines, there is a strong downward motion. So there's a vertical component that is downward, that is not being present elsewhere. And based on that, he concluded that there must be meridional flows. So what I mentioned in the beginning, material that is still accreting onto the planet from the surface of the disk. Also, this has unfortunately only been measured for one disk, HD 163296, the one that we've seen many times already, but hopefully they will find this phenomenon for other systems as well. It's again highly evidence that planets have opened the gap and that they're still actively accreting material. Then finally, circumplanetary disks. So this is really new. There are now a couple of claims of circumplanetary disk candidates. So the planet is not detected yet, but there is something weird in the kinematics that could be explained potentially by a circumplanetary disk. So in this case, there is just this weird block in one of the channels. It doesn't seem to belong to the butterfly pattern. It's really located away from them. And in this case, they measure this so-called Doppler flip. So this is the data, and they subtract a perfect Keplerian profile from that. And this is then the residual. So you can really see that there's this weird Doppler flip. So opposite velocities in this location of the disk. And they claim that this could be a circumplanetary disk as well. However, in more recent work, it was shown that this would also be the result of a spiral. So a Doppler flip is still somewhat debatable as a true circumplanetary disk. So, what is next in kinematics? It's good to remember that kinematic studies rely on really high resolution line cubes involve velocity and spatial resolution. So that means you can only do this for really bright disks, because otherwise it will take forever to take the observation. It's kind of similar to chemistry studies. You can only do the brightest disks because those are the only ones that are feasible. So you may have a bit of a bias there. Features are generally detected by subtracting a model of Canary motion. So that means that you must have a really good idea of the stellar mass, inclination, etc. In order to subtract that model. Otherwise, you will always get residuals. You look, if you have managed to constrain your disk structure perfectly, subtract it, and then your residuals are actually since we're looking at channel cubes, the signal to noise is a little lower than what we're used to with for example, continuum images. So that means that you have to be more careful with imaging artifacts, those you've been covered, but also absorption and theorem, the spiral structures that I mentioned in the Doppler clip, and in general, those signals must be before making the claim. So I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to get a lot of papers in the coming years where people say, hey, there's this weird kinematic feature, maybe it's a planet, and then a year later somebody else publishes a paper, yeah, no, that was an imaging artifact. This also happened in high contrast imaging when people really wanted to find planets in disks. I'm kind of expecting the same thing to happen. So there's not much you can do to avoid it other than observing it again or reducing the data again in a different way. It's just something to be aware of. So there are several tools publicly available to analyze cube data. It's all on GitHub. So it's mostly the work of Richard T. Where there's any better moments. And then there's also DiskMiner, that's with Alice Disperda. So this kind of analysis is not limited to people who have the code, and everyone can do it. If you want to download an ALMA dataset and use these tools with it, you may discover something interesting. And there is an ALMA large program, which I think most of the data have been delivered by now. The PI is obviously Richard T. himself. So he observed, we proposed to observe 15 disks, 0.1 arcsecond resolution, and really high velocity resolution. And with that, he hopes to essentially find many of these kinematic features that I've discussed, and hopefully look for trends and maybe some more systematic ways of analyzing this data. So that's it. I told you I was going to keep this lecture short. So I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of what are the things that are possible with kinematics. And we do have 2 paper presentations tomorrow, so we're going to see. Any questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about what you were saying, that they use this, that they suggested that they could explain with planets, protoplanets, this Doppler thing.
Yeah.
They could use it for that. You say it could be explained by other mechanisms inside of this. But do you think that may be a reliable way to possibly suggest candidates for maybe further exploration?
For sure. Yeah. No, it always helps. I'm not saying that it cannot be a planet. So the paper from Norfolk just showed that there is also another possible explanation. So that it means you need another way of confirming the planet. And I see the main reason therefore, maybe I was a bit too skeptical. So the reason why this is suspicious is that the Doppler field is located at the dust ring. So it seemed a little bit unlikely the planet is located on top of or so close to the dust ring. But who knows?
So there should be a gap.
And then the spiral, you would expect that a massive planet will always carve a gap. So therefore the spiral also seems a little bit more likely. Any other questions? Okay. If not, thanks a lot. The slides of this lecture, I forgot to tell you that. I emailed to Esteban in the break, but he probably didn't put them on the website yet. They are on my website. the website I showed before. It's so nienke.marel.com/atcolo.html. All the lecture slides are there as well. If you would like to have it right now. And I'm sorry, I should have told you that at the beginning. But at least you can have it right. You can go on to that. Yeah, so for the rest of the afternoon, you can continue with your projects. I have to admit, I have a huge headache, and I don't know how long I'm going to stay, but I'll do my best to help you. And yeah, so please come to me with questions, and if it gets too much, I will just leave. So don't worry about draining me too much. Please ask your questions if you have them. And I think Herman wanted to say something about when we were leaving.
Yeah, I was mentioning that we should leave. Well, I mean, one can leave by 5, but if we leave early, then we can pretty much before.
Of course. Yes.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I would say we will bring it.
Oh, okay.
Worry about the metro.
Thanks. Yeah. No, I appreciate that.
I have a couple of Advil.
Oh,
Just for
if you have them with you, oh,
yeah, I have
yeah,
them
thank
with
you.
me for the situation.
Thank you. I mean, I have paracetamol in my hotel, just not here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, this is what I'm looking for, and I have one thing. Starting to do first.
So I take one of these, they have like caffeine and so they're take one of these. Should be.
Thank you so much. So the meeting can, actually, so that I can remember, I didn't know that I don't know who it works. Thank you so much.
No, ya por ahí. Sí. Eso sería el viernes en el 625. Es en el laboratorio de primer piso.